This is the video lecture covering Lesson 19 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this lesson, we will discuss the forms of the aorist active and middle participles, provide a little bit more syntax of participles, and discuss genitive absolutes. Let's begin with a review of participles. Remember that participles are verbal adjectives. So like verbs, they relate to action. They have tense and they have voice. But like adjectives, they have gender, number, and case. You'll recall that they have two major functions. The first function is to modify a verb, and so these are adverbial participles, and the action of the participle is related to another verb in the sentence. The other function is the adjectival function. These are participles that modify a noun. They give us information about a noun or a pronoun, just like any other adjective. In Greek, you'll remember that the forms of the participles differ depending on their verbal and their adjectival features. So participles will have different tenses and voices, as well as different genders, numbers, and cases. To begin with the aorist active participles, a few sort of rules or things to be looking for in these forms. The first is you'll see the addition of a sigma alpha infix throughout. Remember that the sigma is a marker of the aorist tense. The endings of the masculine and neuter are very similar to the third declension nouns. Think about archontas, the genitive form of archon, and this way they are similar endings to those of the present active participle. The masculine and neuter participles have the infix nt, except in the third person plural. And the endings of the feminine forms are similar to first declension nouns like doxa, doxes. And the aorist active participles do not have the augment because it's not in the indicative mood. Here are the forms of the aorist active participles. You can see I've highlighted the different component parts that you need to be paying attention to. You'll see the sigma alpha infix, the unt infix as well, and then the various endings marked by the red font. And so a way to go about memorizing these participles is just to remember the nominative cases in all three genders. So lusas, lusasa, lusan. And from that you'll begin to build lusantos, lusases, lusantos. Lusanti, lusase, lusanti, lusanta, lusasan, lusan. And then the vocative is lusas, lusasa, lusan. Again, identical to the nominative form. You should recognize that these endings are very similar to what you've already seen with the present participles. What you're looking for then is that sigma alpha in the middle of the word right after the stem. Here are the forms of the aorist active participle in the plural. Again, lusantes, lusasai, lusanta are those sort of three forms that you should become really familiar with. And then the other forms build on that. Lusanton, lusason, lusanton, lusasin, lusasais, lusasin, lusantas, lusasas, lusanta, lusantes, lusasai, lusanta. And so you can see there with the green highlighting that the dative plural in both the masculine and in the neuter is different from the other forms that have the unt infix. And as with the present active participle, you must be aware that the masculine singular accusative is identical to the neuter plural nominative, the neuter plural accusative, and the neuter plural vocative. Let's discuss the aorist middle participles. Again, let's begin with some general rules or some things to look for. The first is we are going to have the addition of the sigma alpha infix throughout again. And like the present middle participles, we will also have the infix men for all genders. And then the endings for the masculine and neuter will resemble those of second declension nouns, just like logos or ergon. And the endings of the feminine forms will resemble first declension nouns like agape. So once again, the endings will be very similar to what you've already seen with the present middle passive participles. In this case, there will be no augment, as is the case with all participles in the aorist tense, because these are not in the indicative mood. Here are the forms of the aorist middle participle, again with the distinguishing parts highlighted for you: lusamenas, lusamene, lusamenon. And you can see that that pattern follows throughout the rest of the chart, just like lagos or ergon or agape. Here are the forms of the aorist middle participle in the plural. Once again, these forms, these endings, are very distinguishable. They should be very recognizable. Lusamenoi, lusamenai, lusamena. They have the sigma alpha infix, the men infix, and then these endings that we've come to recognize with first and second declension nouns. So second aorist active participles are a bit more tricky. Remember, second aorist verbs have no difference in meaning. They are just formed differently than first aorist verbs. And so the endings are identical to those of present participles. And in some cases, the second aorist participle will have a change in those initial vowels. And so a verb that may have an eta in the aorist active indicative will return maybe to an alpha or to an alpha iota. Or one that has an eta in the aorist active indicative or the aorist indicative will return to its original epsilon. Again, these are those rules about adding the augment to verbs that begin with a vowel. And rather than try to memorize those rules, you just need to begin to recognize and be aware of that possibility. For second aorist active participles, however, I think that it's in your best interest to add some second aorist forms to your vocabulary list or to your vocabulary cards. And so look at section 132 in the textbook for some of these examples. Agagon, agagusa, agagan is having led. Idon, idusa, idan is having seen. Elthon, elthusa, elthan is having come or having gone. Labon, labusa, laban is having received or having taken. Apon, apusa, apon is having said. Now, second aorist middle participles, unfortunately, are even a bit more tricky. They are nearly identical to forms of the present middle passive participle. The only difference is that the stem on which they are constructed is different. And so in some cases, this means there's only a difference in one letter. So, for example, genomenos with the iota there is a present middle passive participle, but genomenos is an aorist middle participle. And the only way to distinguish these two is that vowel right after the gamma. When in doubt, use your glossary and or a lexicon. All right, let's talk briefly about the syntax of the aorist participle. Like present participles, aorist participles can occur in the attributive, substantive, and predicate positions. The attributive and substantive positions will take a definite article and they have an adjectival function, just like present participles. Similarly, those aorist participles that are in the predicate position do not have a definite article and they have an adverbial function. Remember that with participles, tense denotes the kind of action, not necessarily the time of the action. And so the aorist tense denotes simple or undefined action. Oftentimes, though, this kind of action will be prior to that of the main verb. So when translating aorist participles, I recommend at least at the beginning trying to stick to a fairly wooden translation. And so for the adjective, you would translate it something like the one who did, or the one who saw, or the one who said. Those would be examples of the adjectival use. And for adverbial, you will translate it as having done, or having said, or having come. Or, depending on the context, you might decide to translate it as when she did, or after he came, or after they said. Those would be some examples of the adverbial aorist participle. Okay, so let's close out with some examples. The first is an adverbial use of the aorist participle. Epon tauta taremata ha prophetes ex ilthan ec tu hieru. So you'll notice that I've highlighted in red the participle, and it does not have a definite article before it. So therefore we know that we have an adverbial use of the participle. And so this denotes action that is prior to the main verb, which is ex ilthan. And so we would translate it as something like, having said these words, the prophet went out of the temple. Or, when he said these words, the prophet went out of the temple. Here is an example of the attributive use of the aorist participle. He gune, he didaxa, ta tekna, egagen, auta es tan oikan. You'll notice that this participle, which is highlighted in red, has the definite article before it. Therefore, we know that we're either in the attributive or substantive use. In this case, it agrees in number and gender and case with the noun it modifies, he gune. So we know that we have an attributive participle. And so we would translate this as, the woman who taught the children led them into the house. So once again, that attributive participle is describing or adding some information about he gune. Finally, let's look at an example of the substantive use of the aorist participle. O philomen pros euchestai huper ton hamartesanton es tan kurion. Once again, you'll see that I've highlighted in red the participle, and this participle does have a definite article before it, ton, but it does not have a noun to modify. Therefore, it is standing in the place of a noun, just like any substantive adjective would. We would translate this something like, we ought to pray for those who sinned, or maybe those who have sinned against the Lord. The last sort of new concept to introduce in this lecture is the genitive absolute. This is, in Greek, a specific use of the participle. And so in this case, the participle and its subject are grammatically independent of the rest of the sentence. So the participle isn't going to be modifying a noun in the sentence, nor will it be directly related to the subject and main verb of the sentence. And so in English, we would have an example like this. The test being finished, the students left the room. You could almost break that into two sentences, right? The test was finished, period. The students left the room, period. But this combination of those two verbal ideas is what's represented by the genitive absolute. In Greek, we call this the genitive absolute because the participle and its subject will occur in the genitive case. Here are a few examples of the genitive absolute in Greek. Leguses tes gunaikas ta remata tauta, ekroxen ta teknon. And so we would translate this something like, while the woman was speaking these words, the child cried out. Again, you could think about splitting this into two sentences. The woman was speaking these words, period. The child cried out, period. But by combining them, the woman's speaking and the child's crying out become more closely related. Here's another example. Kathi santos tu archontas epitan thronan, hoi douloi enenkan artan kai oina. And so we would translate this, when or after the ruler sat upon the throne, the slaves brought bread and wine. Again, we could translate the two parts as independent sentences. The ruler sat upon the throne, period. The slaves brought bread and wine. period. But by combining them, there is a sense of sequence. So after the ruler sat down upon the throne, then the slaves brought bread and wine. As with prepositional phrases and genitive phrases, it is a good idea to mark out genitive absolutes before translating. And so you see that I've done that by adding these double parentheses in green font to sort of highlight for you and for me that these are the genitive absolutes. And so they're going to be sort of their own independent verbal idea that is somehow related to the other verbal idea expressed in the sentence, but not as directly as we would with other participles. All right, let's get started with one of the practice and review exercises. This is from the very first one in the Croy textbook. Aspasamenoi tus adelphus, kai tas adelphas, ap elthan hoi apostoloi eis heteron gen. We would begin by finding the simple sentence. In this case, there is no genitive absolute, and there's only one prepositional phrase, eis heteron gen. And so we are left with several more words than in some previous sentences. And so we would, because of the place that we are at in this semester, we would identify the participles. And so the first and only participle is aspasamenoi. And here you can see I've marked it out based on those distinguishing markers, the sigma alpha infix, the men infix, and then the oi ending. And so we would parse this as aorist deponent participle, masculine plural nominative from aspatsomai, which means I greet or I welcome. And so the reason it's deponent is because in the form that you memorized, aspatsomai, it has the middle passive ending with that active meaning. And so in this case, we have an adverbial participle. There is no definite article in front of it. And so that gives us enough information to go about translating the sentence. And so here we are with a translation. Having greeted the brothers and sisters, the apostles went away to another land. Or if we want to add some temporal sequence to our translation, we could probably translate this as, after they greeted the brothers and sisters, the apostles went away to another land. Again, that's bringing out the sense in which the aorist participle is time previous to or prior to that main verb. All right, that is the end of our video lecture on Lesson 19. Thank you very much for your attention.